So we're in the Eucalyptus Valley, which is trends southwest northeast, and the interesting thing about that is that it catches the cold fronts directly coming straight up the valley, and is one of the reasons why the Eucalyptus Valley, and especially the Victoria Peak, which is at the top end of the valley, receives so much rainfall. 3,500 millimeters, highest in South Africa. In the 1800s, there was a lot of settlers coming in and using wood, especially in the Southern Cape forests. And conservators, even at that stage, were concerned about depletion of forests. So they started to look around for exotic species to replace them. And they brought in Eucalyptus from Australia, and they did bring in the black wattle, but that had another use, for tannins. And then the Pinus species from Mediterranean and from North America, and started planting those out. And by even as early as 1900s, farmers were getting concerned because they noticed that their streams were declining below the plantations. And that built up into a real concern, which was taken to the 1935 Fourth Empire Forestry Conference, which is held here in Cape Town.
The Fourth British Empire Forestry Conference assembled on the 2nd of September 1935 for a 5-week tour of South Africa. The Secretary for Agriculture and Forestry, Dr. Phil Yoon, spoke on the question of the influence of afforestation on water supply, about which a controversy had arisen, especially with regard to the use of exotics, notably the eucalyptus and to a lesser extent the pines. They asked the conference for an authoritative opinion.
They acknowledged the problem and agreed to a program of research, hydrological research, which was initiated here. And in 1935, that year, they started building infrastructure in this catchment. So we've been monitoring since 1935 hydrological response of plantation forestry. And we had about 9 catchments and 27 rain gauges set out around the whole catchment. And that has been a great scientific research, which was acknowledged worldwide because it was one place where we got solid results, and we showed quite fairly conclusively the impact of plantations on water. We apply certain rules of thumb. In here where we grow pines, the water use is about 300 to 400 millimeters per year. That's a rainfall equivalent. So it's using up the equivalent of 400 millimeters of rainfall, which doesn't come out in the streams. The way we've done it is through setting up what we call paired catchment experiments, and what you do is you find your pristine catchment and you build your monitoring infrastructure in there, and you monitor it over several years to see how they both respond to the same rainfall input. And then you plant up one of them and you use the other as the control. And you measure the difference that you would expect the other one to have behaved based on what it would have been. And using the other control, you can determine what the reduction that's driven by the plantation forestry. So that's been going on, ever since 1935. Now, unfortunately, the government was the promoter of the research and paid for it, and they have withdrawn their funding now. So it's come to an end, which is very unfortunate because the data set that we've got from this is priceless. Langrivier here is the control catchment and has never been planted up to trees. This is a research weir, and it's what we call a thin plate sharp crested weir with special hydraulic characteristics. So we measure in that little house the height of the water coming over the notch. By continuous measurement here, over years, we can understand what's coming through down the stream. Fortunately, this kind of instrument here, if you look at the sediment in the pool here, It should be a big pool of water, but with the fire, it's altered the hydraulic characteristics of the catchment. And after the fire and the heavy rains, a lot of soil came down and has got trapped in here. Exactly the same setup, and most of the sediment has already been captured higher up, so it hasn't come in here. But you can see that there must be a high level of nutrients coming in here now, because it's full of algae, which is not a normal situation being released from the fire, I think. Internationally, these names like BC Flay and Langrefeer have resonance. You know, all over the world you'll find reference to these experiments. This kind of thing was replicated all around the country, so we had other experimental stations at Cathedral Peak in KwaZulu-Natal, in the foothills of the Natal-Drakensberg, and near Tsanin, and near Sabi at a place called Witklip, and Mukobalan, and we had one near George. Those didn't last as long as this one did, but some of those concentrated on the impacts of eucalyptus on runoff. And the eucalyptus have been shown to be quite a lot more prolific in their water use. So much so that you could bank on about 600 millimeter rainfall equivalent from eucalyptus. But in one or two cases in Tsanin, the catchment dried up completely, and the stream flow didn't reappear until 4 years after clear felling. And the implication of that is that it mined the soil water. So there was a fairly deep soil profile, full of soil moisture, so it used up the rainfall that was coming in as well as the existing soil moisture, which would have originally gone into the stream. So it took 4 years for that soil profile to re-establish itself before it started flowing again. Now what's happening in some parts of the country, like the Southern Cape, is there's a big drought on. They think they're going to run around and cut out aliens in some plantations and get their water back. Well, you can't do that. You can't get the water back until it's had a solid soaking from the rainfall. So it's quite tricky to understand the impacts of plantation forestry in its totality. You know, it's not a business of take trees out and get water back. You know, it's got to re-establish its equilibrium in the environment. The basis of this work has been used by the government to put in place the legislation around stream flow reduction activities, which controls the whole forest industry and where they plant and how much they plant, much to the chagrin of the commercial forestry people. And they have not been very accepting of what's been done here and elsewhere. But the point is, it's true. The science shows that, and if we hadn't had that work, then there would still be a lot of friction. There's quite a bit of friction between farmers and forestry at the moment because of that. The unfortunate thing is, if you really look at how much water agriculture takes in the whole of the country, it's way, way more than that. So, you know, that's where we are today, and there's still this debate about, you know, how much trees use. I think we've established that fairly solidly. It all comes down to managing your landscape carefully and understanding where you want to use water and who's going to use it and what value you're going to add to that water use. This catchment area has had trees in it since the 1930s, and there have been about 3 rotations in them, and you know the water that comes down through these trees runs through our instruments here. These trees are about 30 years old, and really in terms of forestry, it's not very profitable. The way they measure forestry production is what they call mean annual increment. And the mean annual increment here is about 18 tons per hectare per year. That's right on the border of profitability. In other parts of the Western Cape it's lower, 15 tons per hectare per year, and that's outside profitability, and basically the guys are pulling out of their operations. But as I pointed out in that article that you saw in Forestry SA, plantations are just another crop which you're growing for commercial use, supplying the country with wood and timber reserves, resources. So it just comes down to a trade-off. How much water are you prepared to use to grow your timber? And in my view, that's where the forest industry has not been kind to itself. They should have gone in there and said, yes, we do use water, we convert it into money and jobs, and we're providing the country with useful foreign exchange. Trees will use, 50 litres a day, a reasonably sized stand of trees that are between 5 and 7 years old or older. Eucalyptus can use 100 litres a day, but it will range anything up to 1,000 litres a day. Pines are smaller and they don't grow as fast, so they will use anything from 50 to 600 perhaps litres per day. It depends where in the landscape it is. Trees right next to a stream, a rule of thumb, will use twice as much as a tree further upslope because it has more access to groundwater. But it depends on the size of the tree. So the bigger the tree and the faster growing it is, and the bigger the canopy, the more water it uses. Eucalypts grow a lot faster than pines. So when you plant up an area to eucalyptus plantation, you will see a response in terms of declining stream flows within the first 2 years. Because in 2 years, you've got a canopy that's 3 meters, high. Pines will take longer, 5 years. And eucalyptus will reach their peak water use between 10 and 15 years. After that, they're pretty big trees and their water use will stop declining. It's still at a pretty high rate, but the rate has changed, and now the water use is declining as the tree just puts on mass but doesn't grow its canopy anymore. Pines take longer, and you'll see peak water use about age 20 years. So if we like to construct these simple mathematical models and say, just to try and, in doing hydrological modeling, understand how pines and eucalyptus affect different areas, age is an important factor. Now what happens in commercial plantations is you never cut out your whole forest all at once, and you never plant your whole forest all at once. And the point about that is you want to establish what they call a normal forest, which means that you can obtain a sustainable supply of wood over the years. So you're cutting out a certain proportion and you're planting. And if it's eucalyptus, then you could say that you're going to cut 1/15 every year. And if it's pines, 1/20 every year, because they've reached their peak wood production. Because water use is associated with biomass that has been put on. And if trees are not putting biomass on as fast as they were, then it's time to harvest them. Now, if you're planning a forest in a landscape, what you would really want to do in your catchment is have a total normal forest in each catchment, so that any stream will only feel the effects of planting of 1/20 or 1/15 every year and harvesting that. But normally that's not always possible for operational reasons, because your forest estate is no respecter of hydrological boundaries. So there's a bit of mix and match. But the trick, depending on how you are organizing your forest, is if you're organizing it for wood production, then you've got one setup. If you're trying to be sensitive to the hydrological effect as well, then you would try and manipulate your forest age in each of the catchments to be as normal as possible. Some of the species here are quite invasive. Okay, in the Pinus radiata, fairly invasive, as is Pinus pinasta. And the issue there is that they seed themselves, and they have a fire-driven ecology, so that fire sweeping through encourages them to release seeds from their cones, and you get a massive invasion. So they handle the southwestern Cape, especially environment, very well, because it's a fire-driven ecology here too. If you look at higher levels in the peaks around here, you'll see pines even up on the ridge, so the seeds blow up there and they establish themselves. And the issue around these pines, especially in the Western Cape, is that they have a much higher biomass, in other words fuel load, in the landscape than the indigenous fynbos. So when you get a fire in, the heat generated by the wildfire is much, much hotter than a natural fire, which damages the soils. And you can't see it very well today, but earlier this year in February we had a big wildfire. When the fire came through, there was a strong southeaster behind it, and because of the high biomass provided by the trees, temperatures and fire intensity were very high. So that had the unfortunate effect of cooking the soil to a certain extent, which destroys the topmost carbon material in the soil and creates hydrophobic soils. It will run straight off. And when that happens, you get enormous kinetic energy generated, and the erosion is just enormous. Aliens in the Western Cape, where they in a fire-dominated landscape, are bad for the soil and the hydrology. And, you know, one would rather not have them for that reason. Eucalyptus also spread. In the rest of the country, the fire isn't such an issue, but their water use is, and you especially get a lot of eucalyptus species lining the major river channels. And if you look around in the Western Cape on the Berg River, on the Riviersonne end, and further north, you'll just see absolute lines of huge eucalyptus. So you must know what that's doing to water resources in that area. In further north, in KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga and the higher areas, the black wattle Acacia mensa invasion is enormous. And that's probably one of the most serious invaders that we have. And it's uncontrollable at the moment. Working for Water are working very hard to control it, but the problem is so enormous that one has to wonder whether they'll ever get control over it. We've done a lot of the work, the scientific work around plantations, but now things are moving into the impacts of climate change and what's going on. And because we've had this catchment here intensely monitored over 70 years, we've got excellent records of rainfall at a smaller time resolution than the daily rainfall records that you get out of the normal weather station. And we can see fairly clearly that in this valley anyway, rainfall has been going down over the last 70 years. So much so that at the top of the valley, right at the top on the mountains, where we've recorded the highest rainfall in the country, 3,500 millimeters. That's 3.5 meters of rain. We've lost on average 500 millimeters of that. And the important thing to remember in the Western Cape is that the mountains, because of their what we call orographic forcing, produce most of the water resources, you know, that the rest of the lowlands use. So it's important to know what's going on in the mountains, and it's important to know if that's changing and how it's changing. That's what I would like to see continue. And that goes for high rainfall areas in the rest of the country, all along the Southern Cape Mountains, the Drakensberg, the Southern Drakensberg, and right up into the Limpopo province.